Well, g'day folks, and welcome to another bonus video lesson today as part of our chronological Bible in a Year reading challenge. We've just spent the last 39 weeks reading through the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible as it happened. That's the whole idea about reading it in a chronological format. And I thought before we headed into the Gospels, we should have some kind of idea as to what took place between the Testaments, basically between Malachi and Matthew, this intertestamental period of some 400 years where a whole lot of stuff went down that involved God's people at the time and basically sets the stage for the coming of Messiah. So I hope you enjoy this bonus video lesson today. Next week, of course, we head into the Gospel of Matthew. But until then, sit back, relax and enjoy today's tutorial. Alright, hey folks, as you can see from the title of this video, I've decided to do a bonus tutorial this week as part of our chronological Bible reading plan on the intertestamental period. Here we are reading through the Bible in a year. We're 40 weeks in, just finished off the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and about to start the new. Well, before we launch into the Gospels, I thought it'd be a good idea to give you a picture as to what happened between the Testaments, between Malachi and Matthew, or strictly speaking between Nehemiah and the Gospels, because there's actually a 400-year gap in between. Now, many theologians refer to this as the 400 years of silence, because apparently God didn't speak much during that time, but it wasn't 400 years of nothing, all right? It wasn't 400 years of peace and quiet. A lot of stuff happened on the ground there in Jerusalem and with God's people in Judah over those 400 years. And this comes as no surprise to us. After all, Daniel had some very specific prophecies about what would happen after the first wave of returnees came back. So I thought I'd give you a bit of an idea as to what that 400 years looks like, because everything that happens there helps to shape the world that Jesus is born into. It helps sets the stage for the coming of John the Baptist and Jesus there in Matthew. All right, so I hope this is helpful. I'm going to be as general and as quick as possible. Here we go. As I said, there's basically 400 years, okay, between Malachi and Matthew, or Nehemiah and Matthew, and there's essentially four major political powers relevant to God's people. Firstly, the Persians, then the Greeks, okay, then Jewish independence for about 100 years, and then the Romans come onto the scene, and of course that's when Jesus was born. So let's start with the Persians. The Persians, of course, were in charge with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they ruled for about 200 years. In fact, Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, finishes about halfway through that 200-year reign. And part of their legacy with God's people is actually fairly positive. They treated God's people pretty well, let them go back and rebuild the temple, of course, and allowed people, if they wanted to return from Babylonian captivity to go back to the promised land. But one of the outcomes of them treating God's people well, except for that little hiccup with Mordecai and Esther and He-Man, okay, or Heman, one of the outcomes of treating them well is that there remained a big Jewish diaspora, a big scattering of God's people throughout the Babylonian Empire, people who just decided not to come back. Persia's treating them well. Why would we want to go back to Judea and start all over again? Okay, so a lot of people didn't go back. But that's basically the legacy, in large part, of the Persian rule. Now, the Persians were taken out by Alexander the Great, who, strictly speaking, was a Macedonian, but essentially he was in charge of the Greek kingdom and the Greek armies, all right? And he took over the whole of Persia. He went all the way through to India, all the way down south to Egypt, and then died prematurely at 32 years of age, okay? So he conquered a lot, but he didn't rule for very long. And because he died so early, he didn't leave any successor behind him. So what happens? Well, this massive Greek kingdom gets divided up into 4 lots between his 4 generals. Now, this comes as no surprise to you and me, because Daniel prophesied that would happen. He saw a picture of a goat, do you remember, with 4 horns coming out of its head. Well, that's exactly what happened with Greece. Anyway, what's that got to do with anything? Well, basically, 2 of those Greek kingdoms, okay, are on the border of Judah, all right? For the first 120 years, God's people are led by the Greeks based in Egypt or Alexandria. They're called the Ptolemies, all right? And they treat God's people really well. 120 years, they look after Judea, they let them worship God, worship at the temple, do their sacrifices, they inculcate them with Greek culture, give them a value for philosophy, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, those type of guys. And it's in that era that synagogues begin to emerge. Why? because God's people now value learning. They value philosophy, and that's what synagogues are. They're basically places of learning. Rabbis, okay, teachers of the law and scribes, they're really elevated now in Jewish society, mainly because of the emphasis of Greek culture and philosophy and that type of thing. All right, so the Greeks had a real influence on God's people, and of course the Greek language spread over that time. So that's the Ptolemies. The Greeks who were Ptolemies, they looked after God's people, and they even translated the Hebrew Bible down there in Alexandria in Egypt into Greek, and that becomes known as the Septuagint. All right, so in that 120 years, it's a good time. Greeks are in charge, the Ptolemies, the Greeks, but all's going well. However, then the second, one of those other kingdoms, takes over Judea, and they're called the Seleucids. Still Greek, kind of, okay, but they're called the Seleucids, and they do not treat God's people well at all. There's a guy there in charge for 30 years. He massacres 40,000 Jews. He makes Hebrew worship illegal. So he does the very opposite of what the Persians and the Greeks had done previously. Makes circumcision illegal and punishable. All right? He burns the scriptures, and it comes to a tipping point when he one day takes a pig into the holy place on the altar and sacrifices a pig inside the temple. I mean, could anything be worse than that? Well, the Jews have had enough of this, and there is a grassroots revolt against this Greek Seleucid Empire. Okay, so let me summarize. We had the Persians, then we had the Greeks, sometimes good, sometimes not good, and now we have 100 years of Jewish rule. The guy who led that is a guy called Maccabees, Judas Maccabees, and it's over that time where again, the Jews are finally in charge of their own politics. All right, great. They can worship at the temple. This guy becomes high priest, but he also becomes king. All right, and he's not a Davidic king, but anyway, they basically start to mix religion and politics there again in Judah and Jerusalem. And it's in this time that political parties begin to emerge, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, all right? There's theological groups who study the scriptures because of their Greek background, but they're also now involved in politics because the Jews themselves are in charge. So all those classes of people that you see in the New Testament come about in this 100 years. Well, as good as it is being in charge of their own land again, Judas Maccabees is not the Messiah. He is not the promised king. The great restoration of Israel, it looked like it was promising, but it wasn't what the prophets had promised. And basically, God's people go into civil war at the end of 100 years, and Rome, their neighbor, comes in to dispel it and to bring peace. A guy called Pompey, a commander for Julius Caesar, comes in and basically makes Judah Roman in about 63, 64 BC. All right? So the Persians were in charge, then the Greeks, good and bad, then the Jews themselves were in charge, but now, 60 years before Christ, the politics of Judah and Jerusalem, and of course that area now in Latin, what the Romans spoke, is not Judah anymore, it's called Judea. Okay, so now we're going to see the word Judea. The whole area is called Palestine. Okay, that's a Roman, Latin term used. So these names end up changing. So the politics of Rome is in charge. And that's the world that basically Jesus is born into. He's born into the political rule of the Romans. He's born into the culture of Greece, because for a couple of hundred years there's been heavy Greek culture, philosophy, language, written language. Our New Testament's written in Greek. He's born into a climate where there's a thing called the Sanhedrin. It's a ruling council of religious but political Jews who basically are trying to run the Jewish world, but imposed upon by the Romans. Where did they come from? Well, they came from the Jewish revolt, from that 100 years. So in those 400 years, a lot of stuff happened that shaped the world that Jesus was born into. So I hope that gives some kind of understanding as to why the Gospels read quite a bit different to where we left off in Nehemiah. There's all these different characters. There's Pharisees now, and Sadducees, and synagogues, and Romans, and where did all this stuff come from? Well, it came from that 400 years. They may have been silent years as far as heaven was concerned, but they were not quiet years. A whole lot of stuff went on. But good news, that statue that, what's his name, Nebuchadnezzar had seen, of those different kingdoms, okay, where you had the Babylonians, with Nebuchadnezzar, then the Persians, then the Greeks, now the Romans. And somehow there will be a stone cut that wasn't from human hands. The kingdom of heaven, he says there in Daniel, that will strike that statue and the kingdom of heaven will begin. So hopefully from now, we start hearing preaching that says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Let's see if that's what we see come Matthew chapter 1. All right, guys, I hope that helps. And we're going to enjoy the New Testament. We're going to get stuck into the Gospels this week. So join me as we do that. I've stuck to under 10 minutes. I thought I'd try to do that. Bless you heaps. I hope this has helped. Have a great weekend. Bye.
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.